Thank you guys so much for having me. I know when I first got here, Sig had heard me talk a couple weeks ago and said, make sure this is very interactive, which I think means I put him to sleep in the talk a couple weeks ago. So I hope that you guys enjoy this today. It's a pleasure to be here. The thing, Innovasis is a great example for sort of what we're going to talk about today. It's a company founded 2002 or so, but what's impressive about it is sort of going back to the basics the last several years of really focusing on improving their product portfolio and paying great attention to their physicians, to their spine surgeons. And it's sort of what we'll talk about today in terms of strengthening your own practices and so forth. My talk's divided into sort of an introductory part where I'll discuss sort of a summary of what we see going on in healthcare today and how that sort of applies to surgeons and physician practice and spine surgery practice. Then we'll really talk through three different areas. Very simply, types of practice that people are in. Two is headwinds facing practices. And finally, sort of advice for going forward over the next 5 to 10 years for thriving in the future. I would encourage you at any time, this is a weekend of skiing and learning and enjoying yourself. I don't have slides. If you want copies of the slides, either leave me or one of the Innovasis people an email. We'll get those to you. We just authored an article on the same topic, and happy to get you that article as well. We purposely don't do slides, so I want to make sure we're talking with each other and that you have a chance to sort of visit and interact. So at any time you have a question, you have a comment, you don't like what I say, raise your hand, just talk, interact. We're delighted to invite discussion. And so just a pleasure. In terms of core talking points, I'll sort of go through the summary of the talk, right from the get-go, 6 to 8 sort of core points. So you're in an area of time, and we talk about healthcare as a zero-sum game, partially for the following reason. You're in a period of time where there's still healthcare inflation, but it's slowing some. But while healthcare inflation is slowing some, there are certain parties within healthcare, namely really the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies, that continue to mint money at sort of a crazy pace. And this is a business talk, not a clinical talk. And it's not a knock on the insurance companies, it's not a knock on the pharma companies, but what it means is if their revenues and profits are going up 10% a year and overall healthcare inflation is slowing 3% a year, that means other parties within healthcare don't have the inflation that they have. People follow that? And that's where we talk about sort of healthcare, and healthcare is sort of a zero-sum game. So you've got a situation where, sort of as a take-home point, spine practices have average income that's moving roughly, sort of really staying about where it's been, moving up 1% to 2% a year, which is far better than a couple years, several years ago when it moved in the wrong direction. So relatively solid. But where you see is a situation where healthcare reimbursement slowing for physicians, for hospitals, for spine surgeons, but cost rising significantly. So the core point of reimbursement softening, but cost rising. We look at this in terms of 4 starting core points: healthcare inflation slowing, spine practices generally doing okay in the big scheme of things. Maybe not the easy profits that were at some time, certainly out of network, some other things are gone, and certainly the commercial mix is not what it was. But overall, spine practices economically doing okay, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. Third concept, reimbursement softening, but cost rising. So the prescription, and then we'll get back to this in a lot more detail throughout the talk. The prescription is not all that different than it's been the last 10 years. The last 10 years, the practices that really won, there's really 2 things that set them apart, and then a third point. The first 2 are the simplest way to win in healthcare, and it's not been too different for health systems the last 5 to 10 years, is to be the dominant practice in your area. And the dominant practice means it's easier to recruit, it's easier to get good rates from payers, it's easier to get good employees. The whole thing works better if you end up being sort of a dominant practice. Where I see people sort of in trouble, it's often the single surgeon who's phenomenally successful, great for several years, overbuilds and ends up in trouble. But in terms of sort of core paths for going forward, the core things that have worked, it's to be so dominant in your region that people can't go around you, and to be so elite and so good at what you do that people seek you out. 2 core concepts. Then the third concept that goes with that is keeping cost rational. It's the other place where people get in trouble is somehow or another somebody themselves, a developer, somebody convinces them they need to build a beautiful, beautiful building, something that's more beautiful, more of a Taj Mahal than they need. That's the other spot where we see people get in trouble. So we tell people, if you want to win going forward, it's really being great at what you do, being so dominant in your region that it's hard for people to go around you, and you keep cost rational. Those are sort of the three take-home points that we'll keep on coming back to throughout the talk. In terms of core business, in healthcare, probably more than ever before, and in the American economy, there was so much noise about so many different things. And what happens is, like when you talk to health systems and you talk to them about Amazon or Google or Apple, the great leaders say, we're not really so much worried about that, but we are worried about what Optum's doing today, just as an example. We worry about that, not those things. We worry about what our competitors doing. We worry about getting better ourselves. So when I look at surgeons and I look at people that continue to do well, and continue to thrive after all these years, they first and foremost know where their own revenues and income are coming from, and then they're great at using the Bill Belichick phrase of ignoring the noise. They're very good at constantly doubling down on what works. And it's very easy in healthcare and any business to constantly sort of chase the new thing or chase something different and so forth. And what I've seen over the course of my career, largely, not all the time, but when I've seen people chase too quickly or scared too quickly, like I've seen over the years, physicians thought rules were going to change, so they had to get rid of their surgery center. They sold their surgery center. 10 years later, they're still irritated they sold it. People follow that? Or they decided they needed to merge with some group. They needed to do something different. They needed to sell to their hospital. And it's not that selling your hospital is not a great possible long-term path for you, but it's when people panic and don't stick to what's really working for them, they end up in trouble. So we say, in terms of these core thoughts and starting points is, know where your revenue and income is coming from and double down on what works. The last thing, or the last 2 points I'll make before we get into the core of the talk, is that we encourage people, and it goes to this debt issue, the staying lean issue, is to use a phrase, we use stay anti-fragile. And anti-fragile means that you have a relatively rational cost profile in your practice, that you've not overbuilt, that you've not done something crazy. I mean, we had a magnificent spine surgeon in Texas, great physician, great surgeon, overbuilt a beautiful surgery center, couldn't get reimbursed by a few different payers, and ended up having to sell that as quickly as he could, sort of get out of it before it caused him problems economically in the rest of his life. And so there's a concept of doing things incrementally and growing incrementally and sort of staying lean, staying anti-fragile. When I look at practices today, and we'll get into this discussion in a moment, when we sit down with practices, they sort of look at sort of having 3 or 4 choices in what they're going to do going forward. First choice is they sort of stay the course. They sort of keep doing what they're doing. They sort of look out into the future and say, okay, you can't tell more than 3 to 5 years in the future, but say all these different things going on for the next 3 to 5 years, I think our group's going to be okay. So we're going to stay the course. Second concept is they look at, do we align more closely with our hospital? The third concept we see with groups is, do we align today with some kind of private equity sponsored group or some kind of other large group? And there's these big groups. I was on the panel the other day with a CEO of a group that's now a $1 billion practice in Chicago, DuPage Medical Group, funded by a couple private equity funds, but a $1 billion practice, multi-specialty group, $1 billion. Do they align with a group like that or one of the other PE-type groups? But you end up with, really, as a group, always 3 to 4 choices. Do we stay the course and keep moving forward incrementally? Second, do we align with our hospital partner? Third, do we align with some kind of PE group or private equity sponsored group? Or fourth, are we merging with some other kind of group? I mean, those are sort of your 4 choices and so forth. And we'll sort of get into next the different practice models and what's out there. And again, for any of the things we're talking about, we'll try and keep on coming back to summaries on them. And there's also a paper on this. So don't, just try and enjoy yourself, ask questions. If you fall asleep, I don't blame you, I understand.
Scott, I wonder if we can pause there because, I've spent my entire career in a large academic practice, and I probably have very little insight into this. But one of the great things about this group is incredible diversity in where people are coming from. I just wonder who here is in a solo practice, you're really out on your own, and you just, Mike, I knew that you've got some perspective on that. You're really pretty much on your own. Who's with a single specialty group where you're just doing spine surgery in a private practice? And then who's in a multi-specialty group? where there's so pretty good diversity. And who's it in academic department, healthcare department? Yeah. Yeah, so we got the whole spectrum represented here, and I just wonder maybe if some of you, maybe Mike, can you tell us your perspective? You've been in practice now in Amarillo, Texas, for over 30 years. Is that right? And how's that changed? What do you think about your pressures to maybe try and merge with either a private equity group or merge with a larger group? Because I thought Scott's position on this was interesting.
Well, there are pressures. Fortunately, I'm in a relatively small market, and I corner the market somewhat on what I do as far as the deformity goes. But I also do a lot of just regular everyday spine surgery, for which I have significant competition, and virtually all of my competitors are in one group, which puts me at somewhat of a disadvantage as far as being able to go and talk to third-party payers or whatever. They won't talk to me. I can't get an audience. So I'm sort of faced with the issue of falling reimbursements every year and rising costs every year, as I'm sure everybody is. But and I just don't have any leverage. The only thing I do have going for me is the unique part of my practice.
You're anti-fragile. You've got a great practice. You've got a great referral business, and you've got some specialties where you're the best guy in town in.
Yeah, and I'm busy.
Right.
I'm busy. It's just, but from an economic standpoint, the best thing I ever did was get in the hospital business. That's kind of helped make up the difference.
That was the ancillary that you guys really doubled down on.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
so that kind of helps, offset the practice situation. And and every day I think, well, gosh, do I go join this big group? At my stage of the game, I'm not sure I'm ready to not be my own boss.
And most people, and this is a fascinating thing in large groups today. So we're dealing with a large orthopedic group that has spine in it as well. 50 plus physicians. You've got this fascinating situation of the younger guys in the group want to have nothing to do with a merger into sort of a private equity-driven model, where some of the senior guys figure it's if I sell internally to the group, ultimately when I retire in a few years, I get $100,000 out. Whereas if we sell to the private equity group, I might get a few $1 million. So you get this fascinating dynamics that are going on today with private equity chasing groups. Like they weren't. You haven't seen this. For those of you who've been around for 20, 30 years, you saw the last time when private equity got so heavily into physician practice management, and sort of that time, 20, 30 years ago, it all sort of blew up. This time you've got a similar type of thing. We were talking to a large group in another Midwestern state, large group, $200 million a year in revenues, a really orthopedic-driven group with some spine, and they're trying to figure out hospital alignment versus private equity alignment versus stay the course. And you've got sort of ideally, you've got the challenge of, you've got the great situation, at least over the last 20, 30 years, small practice in a smaller market where you could really be almost dominant, or there's not enough surgeons, or you could be really good at what you do, and you make a great income. And it's not sort of a business that you could transition to somebody else, but it's been a great living, and you've enjoyed your practice.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the last thing unless somebody's going to give you a lot of money on the verge of retirement, the last thing you want to do at this point is be an employee.
Right.
Yeah. Can you explain how the private equity arrangement works with the practice and what the mutual benefits are? Because I've never really understood that they can't bring better insurance contracts.
Right.
What exactly are they bringing to give a portion of the revenue away to that PE group? I get that they're going to pay you a salary, you don't have to worry about management maybe, but that's also going to probably drive the practice.
Yeah. So far, there's been a lot of private equity involvement in some other specialties, dermatology, dentistry, GI. There's a lot of GI-driven groups today that are private equity funded, and there's some in ophthalmology, and there's more and more discussion, and there's some in orthopedics. So, for example, I think it's Phoenix, the Core Institute, that sold to a private equity fund. And so the old model of these types of deals was there was something called a scrape, and the scrape was, let's say you make $800,000 a year You're going to monetize that $800,000 a year. This is the old model of doing these deals. And you would take, instead of $800,000 a year, you'd make $600,000 a year, but you'd sell that $200,000 for 10 times. Do people follow that? That would be the upfront economic deal. Like if you went back some time ago, and a lot of deals are still done on this, what you're doing is you're sort of capitalizing the earnings of your practice. So your practice, just a very simplistically, to use a simple example, you're making $800,000, private equity firm comes in and buys you, but there's no real retained earnings. There's no retained income because everything that you make gets distributed. So what you're doing is you're giving up $200,000 a year of your income in exchange for 10 times that $200,000. So you're taking off $2 million. Follow that? That's the core concept. So what's happened now with these deals, the concept is the private equity funds, what's happened in the American economy is the private equity funds who are funded by pensions, insurance companies, the biggest investors in private equity funds are sort of the huge state pension funds, CalPERS, big insurance companies and so forth. And what's happened in the last decade is private equity funds have ended up with so much money in their sort of funds that strategic buyers often can't compete with them. A strategic buyer would be your local hospital, just as an example. So a deal that we looked at in one of the Carolinas, the group was offered like a crazy amount of money by a private equity sponsored deal, and the hospital wanted to buy the group, but the hospital could offer maybe half what the private equity fund could offer, just because the private equity funds have so much money. And what's happened is with private equity, there's less and less public companies to invest in, so more and more of the money in the American economy flows to these private equity funded deals where they buy something, then 3 to 7 years later, sell it to somebody else. You follow me? So the idea here is you buy an orthopedic group, or a spine group at some terrific multiple of earnings, then they buy up a lot more fragile groups at a lower multiple. So they buy one group at 10, that's called a platform group. They buy that group at 10, they're buying a bunch of other groups at 6 to 7 times earnings that have more fragility, that are more worried about it. We'll talk about that in a second. Then their game is really either one of two things. They're either improving practices, adding ancillaries, and or they're then trying to sell it in 3 to 7 years to another private equity group. So they're sort of like the old investment bankers. They're mercenaries. They're in, they're out. They often don't add a lot of particular value. If they're buying into a mature, well-run spine orthopedic group, they're not really adding a ton of value. It's just a financial game.
Scott, what actually happens granularity-wise for them to improve profitability? Is it predictable that surgeons work harder for the private equity group than they do for themselves, or do they work less?
No, I think it's what happens on these old deals. What happens is so in the 20, 30 years ago, and a lot of the guys in the room were around like I was at that point, is those deals mostly all blew up, and because the economics are sort of as follows, and the hope is that they won't all blow up this time. And there's a ton of them again. There's a ton of interest today in practice today, but in the old days they all blew up, and they all blew up. So you get your $2 million to trade in $200,000 your income. So on that day you're a happy person, and then the second day afterwards, you have not forgotten that you got the $2 million. You got the $2 million in the bank, but after taxes it's $1 million, whatever, and now you hate life because you were living off $800,000, and now you're living off of $600,000. So what happens with a lot of these things, they end up being, what you really need to make these things go, they only work if you have great physician leadership that really is excited about growing this, and then a team of guys that are excited as well, that sort of see themselves as, what happens is in American companies, it's very hard today to be a second or third generation company. So most of the companies that become second or third generation companies at some point take in outside capital. So think about this. There's a couple of gastroenterology examples that are going fairly well, at least at this point. But they were set up by really driven physician leaders that wanted to expand and grow. So they've now organized hundreds of gastroenterologists under one PE-backed effort. And the game is today is you can't drop the physician income if you want this to be sustainable. Do people follow that? Because the second you drop the physician income, the physician hates it. I mean, even if they can't go someplace locally because of non-competes, sooner or later, physicians have a limited lifespan just in practice, like all of us do as professionals, and so sooner or later they move on to the next thing. Here's your question.
I see this locally with hospital supplying groups. So
Right.
You're expanding, you can contract at better rates or add go down with guaranteed salary for 5 years. The junior guy, he can't, reimbursement's going down, so the profit's going down, and then that contract we negotiated 5 years. And then,
Well, this is the great dichotomy in it.
with Cedars buying Pearl and Joe,
Right.
they bought a group that was having issues, and it's going further and further down. Yeah.
There are multiple things you said that resonate exactly correctly. One is that you have this very distinct dichotomy in the aging of groups. Like, if a guy's 3 years from retirement, this is his only chance to get a few $1 million out, even though he thought it's a horrible idea for his whole career, all of a sudden it sounds okay. I mean, it's just a natural human nature, and nobody, as they get closer to retirement, has as much money as they thought they would have or want to have. So you get that. Then you get this issue. Hospitals were the big buyers of practices going back 3 to 10 years. They were buying everything, and hospitals were getting paid, as all of you know, much better for the same procedures than you were in surgery centers and other vehicles. So people are familiar with that. They were getting this great delta on outpatient procedures that funded a lot of hospital profitability. They used a lot of that to build up huge physician networks, and we're making a lot of money. Hospital reimbursement is, in the process of getting tougher and tougher. Hospitals are stuck with all the bricks and mortar that American retail is stuck with, so hospitals are in a tougher and tougher position. The last thing they'll give up is the physicians they already bought, because the physicians they've already bought are so important to maintaining the lights on and keeping the hospitals thriving. But there's a love-hate relationship, of course. But you went back 3 to 10 years ago, the big buyers of practices were hospitals and health systems. People saw that in all your communities, I mean, at least to some extent. Less with the orthopedic and spine groups, but some, and more with lots of other groups. Now, hospitals don't have the deep balance sheets they had. So they're no longer in a position to be the best buyers of things. They just can't afford it. I mean, some still can, but by and large, they have to be very careful with their investment in practice investments in anything today, because their reimbursement is tightening and their costs are rising significantly. So you've got what stepped into the gap is these PE-sponsored things, private equity-sponsored things, and they just right now, at this point in time, this moment in time, the private equity funds have so much money. And the private equity, the funds themselves, don't get paid. The private equity deal is they get a management fee for the money that's under management of 2%, then they get a percentage of the upside. But they don't get paid by their insurance companies, their pension funds, et cetera, unless they put that money to work. Do you follow me? They just don't, the 2% doesn't start to kick until they put the money to work. So they're hugely incented to put it to work. So what you worry about in all this practice management consolidation with the PE funds is that you'll have the same blow up you had 10, 20 years ago. They're highly leveraged again. If reimbursement goes too much in the wrong direction, do they end up in trouble? So anyways, to sort of follow up on Sig's point, as he called out on you folks, the 6 or 7 types of practices we see in the country are single specialty spine. How many are in a single specialty spine group? Then you've got spine with orthopedics, or more often it's an orthopedic group that has a few spine guys. How many are in that kind of setting where you're in an orthopedic group and then there's some spine? There's a bunch of people there. You could have groups where there's dominant spine and a few orthopedics, but it's typically the other way around. You certainly have spine groups where there's pain management too, and we'll talk about that some. Then you've got true multi-specialty groups. Who's in a true multi-specialty group where there's 30 multi-specialty physicians and a few spine guys? A handful. And then how many are, hospital, either academic medical center, either employed by the academic medical center, or in a private practice tightly connected to the academic medical center, and two very different things. So a number of you folks, fascinating, sort of fascinating mix in the universe of spine that's out there, and it speaks a lot to spine. The most fascinating I've seen with physician practices, and it's an economic issue, is when practice is going fine, we do have some groups now that sort of see it because of either the opportunity out there, people are throwing money at them. The two things that drive practices to do deals, make changes are, it's the oldest adage in the world, it's fear or greed. So fear, the number one thing that drives people to do transactions and to join into something, anything, is fear. We see groups, if income stabilizes, goes to no increase at all, they start to think about, should I do something? Do people follow that? When you see a group's income go down 10%, this is when they quickly run. And it's not a negative, it's just a reality of it. It's not a negative about the group, it's just the reality of the world. The alternative is an orthopedic group, a real close friend of mine in South Carolina, about 10 years ago, the most independent of groups, as alpha guys as you could ever have. Come to me one day and they say, you're not going to believe this, we sold to our local hospital. And that was not driven by, that wasn't driven by fear, that was driven by just money. but the hospital offered them so much money that they joined. Now there's not as much of that, but it's sort of the fair ingredient that joins these things. When we look at groups, and we'll talk about this as we go forward, 6 or 7 different kinds of groups. They can be large or small, single specialty, spine with ortho, typically the orthopedic is more than the spine, or spine with pain, and then typically it's the spine group with a couple pain physicians. 3rd is part of a multi-specialty group. 4th is hospital employed, often, and it could be academic medical center, it might not be. And then 5th, and we don't see a lot of it yet in spine, but there's a lot of it in other specialties, is this private equity-backed type practices. 6th is payer-owned, payer-controlled. You don't see a lot of this, but in some regions of the country, you see Optum, which is a subsidiary of United, but a $100 billion a year subsidiary that now owns lots of practices. Do any of you in any of your neighborhoods run into Optum? Some. I mean, all of you run into United Healthcare, particularly if you're in Minnesota, but all of you see United. United, as payers were printing money, and they continue to print money, they were the very best at reallocating money and investing in healthcare. Good or bad, whether you like them or not, they ended up in a situation where the company itself is a $240 billion a year company, which is a lot of money, and $100 billion of that now is on the provider side, which is shocking to people. It came out of nowhere quietly and grew, but it's literally a $100 billion part of the company. So more and more payers, private equity sponsored things looking at this. How much inroads they'll actually make in spine, who knows? But it's really driven by practices saying, can we stay the course and do well, or is it too hard to stay the course? Let me stop for a second before we start talking about headwinds in practice and ask sort of the general question. We sort of talked about, guys are really still from a whole variety of different practice models. What I've seen in spine over the last decade or so, and even more recently, it's a lot like you said from Amarillo. It's going okay. It's reimbursements tighten a little bit, costs are up. Administratively, it's harder and harder to manage it all, and and payers are tough, especially if I don't have a market dominant position. I mean, the flip side is we worked with a market dominant group in Wisconsin, and they were so market dominant that as hard as the hospital kept on trying to recruit against them and replace them and become less dependent upon them, the hospitals in town had to keep on coming back to them. You follow me? Because once you build enough of a market dominance, it's hard to build a competitive spine group. You have to be really, as a hospital administrator, if you really want to do it, or as a competitive group, you really have to be in it. Because it's if you bring in 5, you're going to lose 3. Some aren't going to get along in the community. Some are going to end up being not great surgeons, and it's going to take a while till you have to really, if you decide you're going to build a competitive orthopedic group. We have another hospital in Illinois. They've had a long-standing détente with their orthopedic group, a real love-hate relationship. They started a couple of years ago recruiting orthopedic surgeons to be employees of the hospital. And the hospital CEO comes to me recently and says, I don't understand why they don't talk to us anymore, why the group doesn't talk to us anymore. And I'm like, well, you're building their competitor. Of course they don't talk to you anymore. They hate you. It just is what it is. But you see this kind of stuff in groups where people are trying to figure out what's sustainable for the long run. And hospitals have a much harder time doing it. And if they want to compete with you, it takes real fortitude to really build a competitive group. Stop for a second and start talking about headwinds. Anybody have a question yet?
Forward-looking, when you talk about private equity starting to come in and you talk about the money that they have and the money that they have to spend, when do you see private equity start putting pressure on the payers?
Right.
Because the reimbursements are coming down, but when do you see them start going after the payers and going, you know what, no, it's going to have to start coming back up. You guys have a lot of money, we have a lot of money.
Here's the great question. It's all based on what the one lesson everybody's learned the last decade in healthcare, and nobody likes to say it because it's unpopular with the antitrust people, is it's all about market dominance. So if you look at the, I don't know how many of you have HCA hospitals in your community. Who has HCA hospitals in their community? Who has a Tenet hospital in their community? And who has a CHS hospital, community health systems? So the fascinating story coming out of the for-profit hospital chains goes to exactly your question. So the one of those 3 that is crazily successful today still is HCA. Do people follow that? And HCA was built on a model of, we're not going to have the most hospitals on the map throughout the country. We're going to have the most hospitals in specific geographic regions. So in those regions, we're going to empower our CEO, and we're going to try and win those regions, and we're largely going to be in better paying spots than worse paying spots. So when you talk about HCA, they had a very, very clear roadmap. CHS and Tenet, CHS, is there a CHS person in the room? Somebody, I'm not gonna say anything offensive about CHS, but is there a CHS person here? I don't mean it negatively, but CHS has a leader, Wayne Smith, who is the most competitive guy ever in the history of the world. And I give him credit for it. But he is in Nashville with the leaders of HCA. His core goal in life, he had one core goal in life, which was to have more hospitals than HCA. People follow that? I mean, that was his core goal in life. So he finally is like the dog who caught the car. He finally got to the spot a few years ago. We had more hospitals in total than HCA. And this goes to your question about private equity, is he ended up with more hospitals, but all in disparate markets. So we had no market power. So the story of CHS, it's trading at an all-time low in terms of stock price today. It's in horrible shape. HCA continues to mint money. I mean, just like crazy amounts of money. As much as you hear, like years ago when the Clintons came into healthcare and so forth, people were sympathetic to the insurance companies. Oh my God, the Clintons are gonna kill them. And any of us that have been around now for 20 years, and this is not a political talk, know that the insurance companies are doing fine. People follow that? I mean, as much as you sympathize with, like, oh my God, healthcare reform is going to kill them, they seem to be doing okay. HCA has weathered the storm the same way. Other parties that have not had market dominance or market strength have ended up in horrible shape. And CHS and Tenet are two of those that won the battle in having tons of hospitals but not market power. So the smart private equity is, they're very, very smart people, aside from being financial engineers. They're big on investing in groups where there's market dominance. So they don't want to buy 30 different gastroenterology practices. They want to buy 5 in one neighborhood. It's the same thing with your practice. You don't want to be sort of like, you want to be either so market dominant or as an individual or small practice so great at what you do. You want one of those two models. And private equity is the same thing. So as private equity gets to a spot where they have more market strength, then they negotiate well with payers, just like HCA does. Just like your practices do. So if your practice is like in Amarillo, you mentioned, the dominant practice in town has the ear of the payer. Fair statement? Just because that's because the payer can't go around them. And that's the business model. It's the same thing with private equity. So I don't know what way that happens. The flip side is private equity. All these people, even though you're aligned with them, they may be friendly, but they're not necessarily your friend. You're two very distinct things. But so we talk about headwinds facing practice. Other questions. Does that answer your question? So the private equity funds, when they have enough power in the market, they can negotiate well with payers, just like you guys. Same thing.
It gets there. It's just when does the worm turn?
Yeah.
Because it's been heading across the apple for so long. It's got to get to the other side. It seems like it has to.
Yeah, it depends. Like physicians right now are fascinatingly so in a much better spot than hospitals, as an example. The hospitals have become much more commodities. Physicians, for all the talk about oversupply or anything else, there's only so many physicians in the country. Whereas hospitals, there's just, hospitals, the payers, Apple, Amazon, this Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway thing, that's all aimed at lowering the cost for their own employees. And the last thing they want to do is own hospitals. You follow me? So I think the fascinating thing that I see is if you're in the hospital business, you all look at Kaiser and say Kaiser is the model we want. You follow me? Because Kaiser was started as an employer that wanted to control their own healthcare costs, just like Amazon, JP Morgan, et cetera, today. The contrast is that Kaiser is built around hospitals. The last thing Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway wants to do is own hospitals. It's just the last thing anybody wants today is to own lots of bricks and mortar of that cost and that size. The beautiful thing about physicians is you're much more anti-fragile. You don't have nearly the bricks and mortar. You don't have nearly the carrying costs. You're not nearly the commodity that hospitals and surgery centers can be. You follow me? That's why for all this talk, all this noise out there, many, many spine practices are doing fine. So we'll talk about for a moment the depressing part of the talk, which is headwinds facing spine practices. And we'll start with what you just talked about was, we'll go through about 10 to 15 points. Payers minting dollars. They just continue to mint dollars. More and more they put that money to work into different types of provider entities, more and more control. We'll talk about sort of bundling and neural networks in a second, but the payers are trying to make themselves less dependent upon hospitals and physicians. I mean, just by and large. It's much harder to do with physicians. On hospitals, the great sort of, shot across the bow was several years ago, United, through its subsidiary Optum, bought one of the largest surgery center chains in the country, SCA. People follow that? Are people familiar? Like, and they would never have done that if they were still so concerned and so held hostage to hospital relationships. They just decided they're sort of past that point. They're still held hostage in some neighborhoods, but by and large, they were no longer so concerned about hospitals that they couldn't be the biggest owner of surgery centers in the country, which means that they're in the provider business as well, and often trying to move cases out of hospitals into surgery centers that they have some control or relationship with. Second point is sort of headwinds, hospital profits and surgery center profits slowing. And there's always going to be anecdotal evidence where somebody's making a fortune from their surgery center or a hospital's doing fantastic, but by and large, profitability moving in the wrong direction. A third issue, which is a big issue, is you've got this generational shift of business as you have an aging population, as you have commercial business tightening of, on average, people's business moving a little bit more towards being Medicare, Medicaid business. And there's still plenty of you, I am sure, that are out that are just non-Medicare, non-Medicaid. You just don't work with Medicare, Medicaid. But by and large, small percentage shifts, 5% of your shift of your business from commercial to Medicare is generally a bad shift. Do people follow that? Just because on average you're getting paid worse for those cases than you are for your commercial patients. And that shift is going on for a variety of reasons. It's the biggest concern of the Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway is not that they're going to take over what the insurance companies are doing, but that they're actually going to develop big narrow networks. And if you're not in those narrow networks, it means more and more of your business is Medicare business versus commercial business, because those are good paying patients that are going to go someplace else. Third headwind, and again, anytime anybody's got a question, a comment, raise your hand, throw something is a pleasure, is good. Third concept, slower pay, slower approvals, more challenges to getting paid, just sort of nationally. Fourth concept or fifth concept is out-of-network getting tighter. I don't know how many people still work heavily without a network. At one time, in the old days, now in most of your states, one insurance company, one commercial carrier has 60, 70% of the business. Do people follow that? Like there's one dominant payer. At most, there's two dominant payers. Is that true for most of you? We're just like, it used to be the best markets were a market where there were 4 to 5 different payers, each had 20% of the business. And the reason that was the best market is you can go out of network with one of them, you weren't held hostage to the one that had market control. It's very much like the PE discussion. Now you've got a situation where if you're an employer, you have very few choices. You've got in most markets, you've got a United plan or a Blue Cross plan, maybe you've got an Aetna or a Cigna plan, but you don't have all 4 competing against each other. You've basically got to a spot where, like in Wisconsin, it's Blue Cross and maybe United. In different states, it's similar. In Pennsylvania, it's Highmark. In Texas, it's a lot of Blue Cross and some United, I think. But you'll know better than I do. But in most states, it's 1 to 2 dominant payers, and that's it. And the other payers, it's so expensive for those other payers to get into that market because what they have to do is build networks. They have to be able to underprice to employers to sort of build a market. And so they don't want to do it. They just ceded those markets to other payers. And so payers have more and more power. Out-of-network, which used to be a viable strategy, is now not a viable strategy because you can't go out-of-network with the payer that is 60% of your market. Or you're just out of the commercial business in that market largely. So out-of-network's harder and harder, and the payers are tougher about it. There's more bundling. In terms of the bundling concept, in terms of a sixth concept, it's really the question becomes, are you upstream or downstream? If you're controlling the bundle, generally good. If you're downstream the bundle, you're generally at risk. And bundling has been a little bit of a fascinating science so far, in that some of the surgery center chains have played with the bundle to try and incentivize spine surgeons to do cases at their centers. There's some positives in it, even when you're downstream, but fascinating games with it. But you see the evolution of bundling, and it really comes to, are you relatively in control of it? It goes back to this dominant practice concept or not. Seventh concept is sort of massive aging of the population. Massive aging of the population is a plus in that there's going to be spine procedures for everybody to do for the rest of your lives. Because everybody, it's like almost like orthopedics and knees. Everybody at some point has back pain. Everybody at least has to talk to a spine guy at some point. So that's spine guy or woman. Downside is it means more and more of a shift of business to Medicare, Medicaid, which regresses reimbursement to more of a norm or a lower number. A couple of negatives. We're not a fan of the, and there's no offense to somebody that's in the physician-owned distribution business. If you're in pods, you constantly see articles of the government investigating them. If you're in pods, some of the pods, physician distributorships, are done right, where they're truly a business. Others are just a scheme to make money. We're fairly negative on pods, but just, again, sort of a headwind. Those kinds of opportunities are tougher and tougher. By and large as well, ancillary income in practices, whether it's from the surgery center, whether it's from different types of therapies and so forth, imaging, tougher than it used to be. It used to be there were certain ways to sort of, if you were making X percentage of your income from your professional practice, to really supplement it seriously from ancillaries. Those are just getting tougher. It's not that they're not out there, but it's tougher to make lots of money from ancillaries than it was. A seventh point, which is more of a personal point, is there's just a ton of burnout amongst everybody, amongst surgeons, physicians, everybody. We talk to people, you guys don't start really to make money till you're 31, 32 or so. It's not whatever. And the lifespan of careers is not getting longer. So you almost get into this situation where the 20, 30 years that you're really practicing, you got to take great care of yourself, and you sort of got to put money away while it's going good and make smart decisions. Other headwinds, some overbuilt practices, we've talked about that. Some, overall, a spot where reimbursement is softening and costs are rising, and you guys all see that in your practice. Just the administrative headaches in practice, the cost of running a practice are rising versus slowing. The health IT costs are rising significantly, and reimbursement for a whole variety of reasons is softening, not strengthening. It's just not getting any easier. I take it in most of your markets. There's some discussion of neural networks. You'd have to tell me, someone who's been hurt bad by neural networks. It happens in some markets where things really get moved to a different practice. You'll have some states where the payers are just very, very difficult. They say, we just don't want another surgery center, we just don't want another spine practice, and the money and the contracts are really with other practices. You'll see some of that, the evolution of neural networks and the evolution of being shut out of contracts and so forth. The good thing was all these things going on in spine practice, by and large, spine physicians are doing okay. Average income last year is up a little bit from the year before, which is good versus bad. Let me stop. So we've touched on a bunch of headwinds. Most of them, I take it, you folks are familiar with. You're seeing a lot of these headwinds. Reimbursement's not getting easier, right? And you see more movement towards Medicare patients, even though you might not want it. Ancillaries are getting tougher. Is that a fair statement for people? Ancillaries aren't getting easier. And it seems like every once in a while, in urology, for example, in the old days, people made money off of Lupron. Do people remember that? The oncology drug Lupron. And there was a period of time in urology where guys were making 30%, 40% of their income from Lupron. And then the government sort of shut that down. Then they moved towards, lithotripters. People remember urologists had per-click lithotripsy relationships. They did great with that. That got a lot tighter. More recently, urologists have done great through linear accelerators, through radiation therapy and so forth, with different ancillaries. And as it was like whack-a-mole, as one got knocked down, they found another place to replace ancillary income. In many of the specialties today, it's just getting tougher and tougher, is my impression, to make great ancillary income. It's still out there in some places and so forth, but it's a tougher game than it was. In terms of, we've got about 15, 20 minutes left. Any questions before I...
For us, I'm in Southern California, we're a 25-man orthopedic group, owned in partnership with the Orthopedic Hospital in Orange County. But, the single 1 or 2 member orthopedic groups can't even contract with people.
Right.
They won't even contract. So,
Are you with Hogue?
yes.
Okay.
So they won't even contract with them. So they're forced to join the bigger group.
Right.
It seems like there's a squeeze in the healthcare field to push everyone to a foundation model. Because they want to be able to contract with a large entity and not worry about it. So for us, we're looking at how do we better, even a 25-man group really is not hard.
But it's really the game. You've got the partnership with Hogue, which is really helpful. You've got that. Then what happens is, the concept becomes you want to be the consolidator versus the consolidatee. You want to be the person consolidating, and it's hitting this right mix of can you get bigger and bigger and not hurt your incomes and strengthen yourself with payers. But you're exactly right. A payer, you'll have people come to payers with the most creative ideas. And the payers they don't want to deal with it. They just don't want to, there's only so many things they could deal with. It doesn't make any sense. Like they could have somebody come in with a brilliant idea. It's like the old days, people used to complain, surgery centers would complain, the payer won't contract with me, even though I'm offering a service at half the price. People follow that? And the reality is, the surgery center was sort of a fleck on them, was sort of 1% of their total cost. The hospital's 30% of their cost. So even if the surgery center could do something brilliant, it didn't matter. Because if the hospital raised their cost 0.0%, 0.02%, it took away any gains they had from working with the surgery center. And it's similar with the group. It's very, very hard. If you're going to be an independent or solo guy, you have to be so lean and so good at what you do, and just choose that's how you want to practice. There's no sort of, you might be able to do it for the rest of your career, like you're doing. You might be able to do it for the rest of your career. But the goal is to be very lean, and make a great living. But it's harder and harder.
So it sounds like we have to somehow affiliate ourselves with the hospital through a contract. Our major goal now is to figure out, and we're kind of in a unique situation since we own the majority of the hospital, well, not the majority, but.
But you own it with Hoag too.
And we control the board, that maybe we can be part of a hospital foundation which we control.
Right.
Whereas
I mean, what you really want,
Because it's a hospital contract with.
right.
Both the facility and the provider fee, that's, I think, gonna be much better leverage than physicians on their own.
Yeah, you want to be a dominant physician group and so great a physician group that patients and payers have a hard time going around you. And it's harder in the big markets. I mean, it's much easier to be an 8-person group in the middle of North Dakota where they just can't go around you. There's no choices. And we've seen plenty of people that were willing to move to smaller communities, just, clean up because there's no choices. But in your community, it's the same game. But you have to be strong enough that payers can't go around you. That Hoag and you are so strong that people look at it and say, we need them in our network. That's the game. Very simply.
Here's the new thing that, speaking about going around us, now in Amarillo, employees of Walmart, if they need spine surgery, get shipped off.
Right.
They go to Houston or Chicago, or they pay their airfare, they pay for the family to go, they put them in a hotel, and
Well, this is the stuff that's been talked about for the last decade, this movement towards narrow network and bundling. But this is what Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway, this is their first goal. Their first goal, and not necessarily at spine surgery or big surgery, but their absolute first goal is not, altruistic to help the healthcare system as a whole, but it's to better serve their own employees, and to better reduce their own healthcare costs. So you look at something like that. This is where, as a practice, if you're not part of these networks, not part of these narrow networks, you end up with this averaging of your reimbursement moving more and more towards the Medicare part of the population. Because you just end up with less commercial patients to serve. But you see more and more of that. You talk about the fascinating thing you saw the other day, it was either Walmart or Walgreens said that they're moving virtual visits from $40 to $4. People see that in the news? They're making virtual visits $4. And all of us know you can't make money off a $4 virtual visit. It just doesn't make any sense. You just can't do it. But what you can do is sell a lot of prescription drugs. You follow me? It's like, it's like the oldest game in the book. They're not going to make money off of prescription drugs, so you're not making money off the copier, you're making money off of selling cartridges. They're not going to make money off of virtual visits, but this is a way to sell lots of prescription drugs. It's a fascinating move, and it's scary to anybody else, anybody else in the business. Yes?
Scott, I'm going to be selfish and ask an industry-related question more so than maybe as it relates to physicians, but it could. We've heard a lot, you just talked about the power of the payers. Mike just talked about Walmart doing kind of an end around on the physicians. Have you heard anything, is there any buzz at all about the potential for those same payers you're talking about that keep strengthening in this economy to take over the distribution and sale of medical devices? So in other words, Blue Cross makes the decision to either in a local market or nationally, instead of this hospital markup that occurs that just drives costs up, right? Because we sell it to the hospital at our markup, the hospital turns around and bills the payer 4 to 6 times that amount. We see those sheets a lot of times. Is there any risk that occurs?
Right.
Or
So
do you
it's
see
a
anybody
great
talking about it?
question. We see much more, so I don't see at this point the payers getting into the device business itself. When you look at the 3 parties that have done really well the last decade or so, people think in terms of the insurance companies, the pharma companies, and the device companies. The device companies are the one of the 3 where inflation is sort of a lot more than as pharma or insurance companies. So it's sort of, in some ways, it's more and more self-regulated in that the device inflation is nowhere near what it is in pharma and in insurance. So when you look at this thing, like people are familiar in some of the big not-for-profit hospital towns, of the hospitals have developed this aggregation to build their own generic pharma company. You follow me? And the reason is they were just getting, you talk to a typical hospital system, $4 billion system, it's got a $300 to $400 million bill a year for pharma. literally, and it's got no control over that cost at all. It's got that cost is going to 60, 100 million a year. So if you're a big health system, they're, because pharma has become so costly, they're hardcore getting into the pharma generics business. Whether that's going to work well or not, I have no idea, but it's where the real sort of core concern point is right now. The device company side, I think what you've had, device companies, again, no tag days for the device companies, but not nearly seeing the inflationary increases that the pharma companies are seeing or the insurance companies. So I don't know at what point, but you certainly see more and more health systems and surgery centers to an extent, but health systems being very disciplined about saying, we'll only buy from these 3 device companies. We'll only use this versus all of them and stuff like that. And they need to, for administrative reasons, for a lot of reasons. If they're dealing with if 800 guys' preferences, they want to shoot themselves. And it's economically hard. So you do see some of that kind of pressure. Let me sort of go through just strategy for the next 5 to 10 years. And again, it's much what we covered on our, do you have a question?
My practice, you hear me okay?
Yes.
My practice is in south central Idaho. And every headwind that you've mentioned so far, I've experienced. And I'm a solo spine surgeon with 2 employees. And so I feel these pressures, but my really biggest concern now is this talk of population health and what at least our predominant hospital system, St. Luke's,
Right.
has been really talking about and how it's going to impact solo practitioners, independent doctors like myself. And what really concerns me are these relationships that they're making with these insurance companies.
Right.
And they're trying to steer care, like for instance, spine surgery, and what they're coining this term duplicity of care. So if there's, say, 10 hospitals in this St. Luke's system, they're trying to,
Yes,
drive
have it
them
all
all.
go to
That's
one
right.
or two
In
of
this
them.
situation, be going to, say, Boise. I'm in Sun Valley, Idaho.
And how far are you from Boise? How far?
About 120 miles.
Right. And so, the question is, you end up in a situation where day-to-day spine care, you assume is going to stay relatively local, and then you have to work like crazy to get your share of surgery going forward. Just because, as you see, it's much what you're talking about in Amarillo. If surgery starts to get shipped out, now geographic barriers don't mean the same. And so what you try and do is be in a large enough catchment area and be dominant in that catchment area and hope that the world works with you for the next 10 years. That it doesn't, meaning that there's not so much of this vacuuming of stuff out. And the flip side is that as much as Walmart's been talking about this for 15 years now, and you're just starting to see it, the good thing about much of this, and this is why we tell people not to panic and to ignore some of the noise, and again, not always right, but what happens is like the St. Luke's, and Boise and so forth, they've been trying so hard to control that market for so long. They had a horrible antitrust case a couple years ago related to it, and things move a lot slower than they talk about them. So you sort of, and you're the judge of that better than I am because you see it day in, day out, but it's trying to be as dominant locally as you can and be great at what you do. And then it's like, then you have to decide if it doesn't work at some point, then you sort of got to move into a different direction.
As spine surgeons, are we giving up a big bulk of, because the big cost of it is just non-operative back here. And should we start getting into the business of saying, we want to control all of the back here? Obviously, by doing that, we still get to select out the spine cases.
Right.
Now we can take up a big slice of the pie because it's all individualized. And you guys want to maximize how many injections they want. The
Right.
PT wants as many visits. And if you can
So what happens is, so here what you have is obviously you see examples of this in certain markets where people have been very successful with that. Texas Back is a good example. They not just surgery, but pain and all the other specialties and so forth. And there's a lot of practices in Texas that are built the same way with lots of different answers. The great concern is, of course, building that kind of model, it works in a great fee-for-service environment and may continue to work for a long time. The concern with that type of model is just the costs that go with it. Because you're building, the most profitable thing you all do, almost certainly is spine surgery. You follow me? So it's like much when hospitals owned all these primary care practices, it's a very expensive carrying thing. And so they would estimate that on average they lost $100,000 a year on their employed physicians, but they made it up on the back end. And so if you look at a spine practice and you're growing out of being a spine practice and all these other things, it takes a lot deeper discussion than we'll have today as to whether that's the right model and you could do it in your market. Because you have to fund that through those ancillaries and other physicians making money through it working? So it's a great question as to whether,
Talking about, well, not a profit center, but a cost
no, I understand. It just is,
to try to,
yeah.
to bring the total population here down.
And there's plenty of people, who in this model has that kind of spine practice where you've got pain management in your practice, you've got everything else, you've got all kinds of, you guys do. And so, I mean,
The hospital, the surgery center.
yeah, when you're sort of a little bit of a different animal than just that, but you've seen some of this, and it's just a question of the carrying cost of it versus the market dominance, the market strength you could have, and whether it ultimately leaves you to do the kind of things you want to do. You know, I mean, sometimes it's worked great for some practices, you know, but you'd have to go deeper into it with some people than me. So let me talk just real quickly for a few minutes on what we see, and a lot of these things we've already talked about is, with all the noise out there, the number one thing you could be is regionally dominant, and obviously it's easier to be regionally dominant in a smaller mid-sized market than a huge market. You know, in a huge market, you want to be like in Chicago, you want to be like Midwest Orthopedics at Rush, you want to be one of these groups that's so big and so tied to your academic medical center that it's hard to go around you. That, you know, if people want serious orthopedic care, serious spine care, you're going to be on their very short list. Same thing in a lot of your communities, whether it's, you know, in the Twin Cities, whether it's in your practices, it's being so dominant, so strong, that it's hard to go around you. Great patient experience, more and more, and also great skills, just with all the noise out there, actually taking care of patients really well, particularly in markets where there's still referrals and people and business and people coming back to you. Taking care of patients, great, and great skills, still just as important as anything. So great regional dominance, great patient experience, great skills as a surgeon. You know, it's still being the elite surgeon in the area is the best thing to be, to where there's not another choice. If you're in South Central Idaho, people don't have that many choices, and you want to be the best guy in the area so that you're not just taking a spot in the area, but you're actually great at what you do. So elite and great patient experience and keeping as much spine care home as you can. Fourth, we've already talked about this, and it's so important, is keeping cost rational. Big costs are a anchor around you. You want to avoid that. Fifth, which is it's preaching. I don't mean to be preachy. It's sort of take care of yourself. The careers in all these high-stress professions are unfortunately shorter and shorter, and you lengthen them by taking care of yourself. It seems like preachy, but it's just true, and we see too many guys at the ages that we're at starting to burn out on it, and it's really, that is very important. The next point, fifth or sixth, is, well, cultivate payers in hospitals. We've seen some groups do just a great job of staying close with their payers in hospitals. It's obviously easier if you have a larger group with the payer needs to talk to you, but you want to constantly have that seat at the table. So as things move in your neighborhood, you know, you never want to be the last person to know it. You know, aside from pitching and cultivating relationships, we were with One Health System, had a much better contract time this year because 3 years ago they made a much more intensive effort to stay and develop and cultivate the Blue Cross plan in their market. You know, and they just needed to do it. I've seen the same thing with a spine surgeon in Seattle. He and his group have just made a lot of effort over the years to cultivate payer relationships. They might not always get what they want, but they at least have a seat at the table. They're at least in those discussions. You know, and many people don't have the stomach, the interest, or they hate the payers, but at some point it's your biggest customer, and so you got to try and stay close with them. It's same with your hospital. It's not, you know, the hospitals, it's often a love-hate relationship, but where you can, it's cultivating those relationships and having a seat at the table, so at least as things change over time, you at least know what's going on. Like, it's like, what you want to know is up front that this is changing, so you have a chance to try and address it. Once it's done, it's hard to undo with a lot of these things, whether it's a whole variety of things. Lean, in terms of running your practice, and when we talk about lean in running your practice, what we talk about is not being overstaffed, but we also often mean you're paying great people better than market. So you don't have to be overpaying everybody, but you're far better off paying your people, your great staff well and keeping them than playing catch and release with staff. But it also means you generally can't be too overstaffed today. You want to have enough capacity that you're solid and in good shape, but you can't be stupid about your staff, but you want to be paying your staff better than market, as good as market. And the beautiful thing about mid-sized practices is if you make an exception for somebody, you're not like a health system where you're making an exception for 1,000 employees. So we're a big fan of staying lean, but overpaying your people a little bit each in general, and particularly your great people. You need people coming back to work every single day, one, because they're happy in the environment, and two, not waking up every single morning pissed about what they're making. You follow me? I mean, it's just too much stress in your practice. So it's like you're far better off not having too many people, but paying each of them a little bit better than you have to. And people can criticize it. We used to be able to get, I'm in the media business as well. We used to be able to get writers for $30,000 a year. We're like, well, they'll take a job for $30,000 a year. But the problem is that $30,000 a year, the second they get the job, they're trying to figure out, hey, I can't move out of my parents' house for $30,000 a year. People follow that? And we finally got to the spot, even though we could hire them for 30, we started having to pay them 45 because we couldn't have them keep on leaving. Great, whatever it was, that was a starting salary. It just is what it is. But we're a big fan of it in any business. Overpay your people a little bit, even if you don't think you have to, and you're much better having stability than not, especially in today's world where there's, unemployment is so low and so forth. Lean on debt and building, we've talked about that. Focus on your strengths. Some of the most profitable spine surgeons I've known in the country, one of them I knew years ago, narrowed his practice down to, and he was able to do it. He was in a rural state, said, I only do these 5 procedures. This is what I do. This is all I do. And just ultimately, it takes a lot of discipline to decide, we're not going to be everything. This is what we're going to do. And just did fabulously well with it. Most of us don't have that kind of wherewithal. We're scared to let go of every patient. He basically, this is the 4 things I did, and he just literally did fabulously well, at least economically with it. If a couple other thoughts, the bundles, you want to experiment and work on bundles. Bundles are coming in some way, shape, or form. It's much like this neural network things and stuff like that. You want to be involved in them and see what's going on and test them because you don't want to be in a spot where suddenly you've missed. It's not that you have to be, if 80%, if you're doing great in your practice, the first thing you want to do is spend 80% of your time, keep on doing what you're doing. Then you want to spend time looking at these other things. You want to experiment with bundles. You want to stay close to your payers. You want to cultivate relationships with their hospitals like that. But you want to keep doing what you're doing. The bundle side, the scary thing is exactly the point you talked about. Like all of a sudden, and you basically say, it's okay. I'll do fine for the rest of my career. It's okay. But the scary thing is when somebody else is part of the bundle, or somebody else controls the bundle, and cases are moving away from you, whether it's in Boise or Amarillo or wherever, where all of a sudden your group is out of the bundle. So it's sort of like, how do I have a seat at the table and at least have those discussions and test these things to see how they go? We talk about seat at the table. We're not a fan of, and I know some guys are in them, of the physician-owned distributorships. It's not that some can't be done well. We're also not a fan in terms of thriving in the next years. I know there's a surgeon on the West Coast that's in jail now, I think, that did about 27 spine procedures on somebody. We used to joke about podiatrists. The only reason they don't bill for 12 procedures is there's only 10 toes. You don't want to be that guy. I mean, there's just no need. It's like you want to be a great surgeon. You want to be great at what you do. You want to keep your costs rational, and you want to be as market dominant as you possibly can. I think we could, the last point we've already touched on, it's taking care of yourself, and these end up being more limited careers than you expect. I have a spine surgeon, a close friend, ended up with a nerve injury, can't operate anymore, and the concept I have is, well, you can make sure you're living within your means, living rationally and stuff like that. Just put dollars away where you can. So these end up being shorter and changing careers, more stressful careers than they used to be. And it's important that you take care of yourself and so forth and so on. That's all I've got. Sig, any questions? Thank you.
Scott, that was terrific. I think you really had something for everybody in the audience here. Well, one of the questions I want to follow with is, as insurance companies are developing more and more narrow networks, what are they really looking for evidence to suggest that this practice ought to stay in their network? So are they looking for length of stay, complications, patient satisfaction? What do you think they're really looking for? Because in a lot of instances, some of the quality metrics, we had a talk yesterday, that some of the quality metrics, in fact, can be perverse incentives to do something less, something inadequate in some ways, but avoiding a 30-day readmission, avoiding a complication.
Yeah. In terms of what payers are really looking for, it's really a complicated issue, and it really means really staying close to the payers. Because what happens is, at the end of the day, payers are looking for how do they get this as low a cost as possible without pissing off their network, without sort of pissing off their population, their employers, and so forth. So payers talk about quality, they talk about evidence-based, they talk about everything else. At the end of the day, it's the unusual payer executive that's really looking deeply at it, unless there's a problem. If you got a problem and you're an aggressive actor and your numbers are really bad, then it's a problem. But they're not really looking to say, this person's stats are great, we want to do more business with him. We just hardly ever see it.
Yeah, I think it was a great talk. I appreciate that. I'm not different, and think my practice is hit every single thing you talk about. But we're looking at the future and the zero-sum game in terms of, what's going on. And I think at some point, part of this was we have to align ourselves with something. Who's going to be the one that wins out? Is it going to be industry?
Right.
Is it going to be hospitals? Is it going to be payers? Where's the, or is it going to be other industries that are going to pay for their healthcare? Where should we be targeting in the future, really?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a very tough answer. So, for example, in your market, you have a couple dominant health systems. HCA is one of them, and you have another dominant health system too. It's not the University of Colorado related system, or Centura. Okay, so it's very, very unclear. It's like, and you sort of look at this, and we have more and more large successful groups with like so many changes going on in the American economy. Just concerned about exactly the question. Do I align with our local hospital system? Do I align with some other group? And we see groups that have great relationships with the local hospital, and you first sort of start there, at least looking at opportunities. But the flip side is groups that don't want to have anything to do with their local hospital. They want to do it with a PE-sponsored group of some sort. And I don't have a great crystal ball on who wins going forward. I know that if you keep on taking care of business, your group stays strong, stays market dominant, stays elite, continues to make money, doesn't make stupid investments, then you're likely to continue to have choices going forward. The place where groups get in trouble is, number one, is they've made dumb investments. They just put themselves in a bad spot. Sometimes groups just also age out of existence. They just were a magnificent group at one time. They're just not anymore. But I don't have a crystal ball on it.
How big does a group have to be to get the attention of private equity groups?
Well, that's a great question. So what happens is private equity groups have two types of groups. They have a platform group, which means a group that they sort of consolidate around. Then they often have smaller groups that are add-on acquisitions. So the add-ons, if they're consolidating in, pick an area, St. Louis, they might want to team up with one of the larger orthopedic or spine groups, and then they're going to want to add on lots of other spine and orthopedic groups. Because they only win if they build more market strength, more EBITDA, and then they can sell it to somebody else for a bigger amount going forward. But there's a distinction in any of these businesses. There's a platform group or platform business, and then there's what's called bolt-on acquisitions or bolt-on businesses. So our firm represents a dental one, bought a huge dental practice and has now done 40 add-on dental acquisitions, just as an example. Not me directly, but some of our colleagues. But that's how they operate. So there's not necessarily size, but what really happens is if you're a 2 to 5 person group, unless you just happen to be this, crazy, crazily busy, superb group, but even so, there's fragility in a small group. So you're more likely to be a bolt-on group than a platform group. And it doesn't mean might not be the right thing for your practice at some point. And you have when I say fragility, if you're built around 3 guys, one dies, all of a sudden your group only has 2. It's that kind of fragility. It's not just, it's those kinds of things. Other questions?
Who are the right people for us to go as leaders of our spine practice or multidisciplinary group? Who do we go to for consulting advice, because there are billions of consultants out there?
Yeah, here's my advice on this. So I'm a huge fan of this. Is that all consultants suck, and what I mean by that, and I say that somewhat facetiously, but it's somewhat true. Consultants are as good as the people they're working for. But what I do think, the number one point of reference or guide I have is, before whether in the media business or the law business will buy anything from anybody, I will say to them, tell me who you work with, and I want to talk to who you work with. You follow me? And so before you sign on with any consultant, anybody, you want to say, who do you work with, and going to talk to that person. The flip side, and the better way to go about this is, you go talk to 5 of your colleagues that are not competitive with you, but that you trust, and either have built great groups, or you think they've built great groups, or you think they know what they're doing, and ask them about what they did and how they did it. And it's uncomfortable because you have to actually ask your peers. You follow me? But it's a far better pathway for willing to do it. So, because the consultants are sort of they're fine, and some of them are actually very good, but you really want to start with, do you have a colleague's practice where you could have a colleague's practice, who will legitimately say, we worked with that person and we love that person. They were great. This group was great. But I always start there.
Is your group a resource?
Not really. I mean, we could help direct you to other consultants, but we can. We don't do consulting at all. We just don't do it. We're a law firm.
But you know everybody.
Yeah, we do, but we don't. But what really happens is, and what happens with these big consulting firms, they're all very fluid. I mean, there's people, but the consulting firms, you know, if you're a consulting firm and you've got this brand, you know, you've got that brand, there's 1,000 different consultants at that place. Some of them are great, some of them are bad. Just like in your 30-person practice, some of them you'd have operate on your cousin, some you would not. You follow me? So it's not really, there's people, there's groups, and there's people that are better than others. But I would really start with your colleagues and ask them. And you have to ask them enough so they're not just sort of touting because they like to tout. Who do they work with that they really like? I mean, that's really where I would start.
I just don't see how that'd be that helpful, because I don't know anybody in the DFW area that I would say, can I get advice to?
But you don't want, it doesn't have to be in the DFW area. What you want to talk about is like if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you want to talk to your spine colleagues in other areas and say, we're trying to figure out what to do. You guys have gone through strategic growth. You've looked at your practice. You've done other things. Who did you use? Who did you talk to? How did you discuss these things? I mean, that's where I would start. I mean, there are people that specialize in spine consulting, orthopedic consulting. Sig is telling me I got to get going. I could tell. But I would really start with your colleagues. I mean, guys around the room, there's probably a wealth of experience here of people that have worked with consultants that they either love and think are great, or they say like, oh my God, we would never use that person again. That's my thought. I'm happy to discuss it with you further. Thank you, Sig, very much.
Scott, that was terrific.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Did something for everybody
Thank you.
here. Thanks so much.